There is a moment in history, a single transaction, that perfectly encapsulates how empires are truly conquered in the modern age. Not with armies. Not with cannons. Not with the dramatic clash of civilizations that fills our history books. But with paper. With loans. With interest rates and repayment schedules and the quiet, patient accumulation of debt until the debtor has no choice but to surrender everything. In November of 1875, the Khedive of Egypt, desperate for cash to pay his European creditors, sold his shares in the Suez Canal, the most strategically valuable waterway on earth, to the British government for £4 million. It was a fraction of their true worth. Everyone knew it. The Khedive knew it. The British knew it. But the Khedive had no choice. The debts had to be paid, and he had nothing left to sell but the crown jewels of his realm. 6 years later, in 1881, the Ottoman Empire itself would follow the same path, surrendering control of its finances to a committee of European creditors in a humiliation that marked the effective end of 6 centuries of imperial sovereignty. These were not coincidences. They were not accidents of history. They were the calculated results of a strategy so elegant, so devastating, and so perfectly designed that its victims often did not understand what was happening until it was far too late. This is the story of how Britain used debt as a weapon of empire, how the Ottoman world fell into a trap it could not escape, and why understanding this history has never been more important than it is right now. The roots of the Ottoman debt trap stretch back decades before the final crisis, to a moment when borrowing seemed not just reasonable but necessary. In the early 19th century, the Ottoman Empire faced an existential threat. The world was changing with terrifying speed. European nations that had once feared Ottoman military power were now surpassing it in every dimension. European factories produced goods faster and cheaper than Ottoman craftsmen could match. European armies wielded weapons that made traditional Ottoman forces obsolete. European navies controlled the seas that had once been Ottoman lakes. The empire that had besieged Vienna was now struggling to defend its own borders against Greek rebels, Egyptian warlords, and Russian expansion. The Ottoman response was modernization. Beginning with Sultan Mahmud II and accelerating under his successors, the empire embarked on an ambitious program of reform known as the Tanzimat. The old Janissary Corps, once the terror of Europe but now a corrupt and ineffective force, was abolished and replaced with a modern army trained on European lines. New schools were established to create an educated bureaucracy. Legal codes were reformed. Infrastructure was planned, railways, telegraphs, ports, all the machinery of a modern state. These reforms were necessary. Without them, the empire would certainly have collapsed even sooner than it did. But they were also expensive, far more expensive than the traditional Ottoman revenue system could support. The old empire had financed itself through land taxes, customs duties, and tribute from vassal states. These revenues had been adequate for a medieval empire but were wholly insufficient for the project of rapid modernization. The gap between what the reforms cost and what the treasury could raise had to be filled somehow. The answer, as it so often is, was debt. In 1854, the Ottoman Empire took its first major foreign loan, borrowing from British and French banks to finance the Crimean War. The terms seemed reasonable enough. The interest rate was manageable. The repayment schedule was generous. European bankers presented themselves as partners in Ottoman modernization, eager to profit from the empire's development while helping it achieve its goals. The loan was a success. The money flowed in. The war was fought. And a precedent was established that would prove fatal. Over the next 2 decades, the Ottoman Empire borrowed repeatedly from European banks. Each loan seemed justified at the time. Money was needed for railways that would knit the empire together and facilitate trade. Money was needed for ports that would connect Ottoman commerce to world markets. Money was needed for military equipment to defend against Russian aggression. Money was needed to suppress rebellions in the Balkans. Money was needed to maintain the court, to pay officials, to keep the machinery of empire running. Always, there were excellent reasons to borrow more. The European banks were eager lenders. The Ottoman Empire, whatever its difficulties, was still a vast realm with enormous resources. Its territories included some of the most fertile land in the Mediterranean, some of the most strategic locations on Earth, some of the most profitable trade routes connecting Europe to Asia. As long as the empire survived, it could surely service its debts. And if it could not, well, that too could be profitable, as the bankers well understood. What the Ottoman officials failed to appreciate, or appreciated too late, was that they were not simply borrowing money. They were entering a system designed to ensure their eventual subordination. The loans came with conditions. At first, the conditions were minor: requirements for financial reporting, preferences for European contractors, small concessions that seemed insignificant. But with each new loan, the conditions grew more onerous. European powers demanded the right to protect Christian minorities within the empire, giving them pretexts for intervention. They demanded commercial privileges that disadvantaged Ottoman merchants. They demanded legal exemptions that placed European citizens beyond Ottoman law. The mathematics of compound interest, meanwhile, worked inexorably against the empire. Each loan had to be serviced with interest payments that reduced the funds available for actual development. When revenues fell short, as they often did, new loans were taken to pay the interest on old loans. The debt grew not arithmetically but geometrically, doubling and redoubling while the revenues to service it remained stubbornly flat. By the early 1870s, the Ottoman Empire was spending more than half of its total revenue simply servicing its debts. Not building railways. Not modernizing the army. Not developing the economy. Just paying interest to European creditors. The crisis came in 1875, triggered by events beyond Ottoman control. A financial panic in Europe caused credit markets to freeze. Banks that had eagerly lent to the Ottomans suddenly demanded repayment. New loans to roll over old debts became unavailable at any interest rate. The empire, which had become dependent on continuous borrowing to meet its obligations, found itself unable to borrow more. In October 1875, the Ottoman government announced that it could not make its scheduled debt payments. For the first time in modern history, a major sovereign power had defaulted on its obligations to international creditors. What happened next reveals the true nature of the debt trap. The European powers did not accept the default and move on. They did not write off their losses as the cost of risky lending. Instead, they organized. They coordinated. They formed a united front that transformed individual creditors into a collective force more powerful than the Ottoman state itself. In 1881, after years of negotiation conducted from a position of Ottoman weakness, an agreement was reached that would reshape the empire's future. The Ottoman Public Debt Administration was established, an organization unlike anything that had existed before. This was not merely a collection agency pursuing debts. It was a parallel government, controlled by European creditors, with extraordinary powers over Ottoman finances. The administration took direct control of significant portions of Ottoman revenue, customs duties, taxes on tobacco, silk, spirits, and other commodities, even the tribute from certain vassal states. These revenues flowed not to the Ottoman treasury but to European creditors, managed by European officials appointed by European powers. The administration employed thousands of people, more than the Ottoman finance ministry itself. It had its own offices, its own bureaucracy, its own armed guards to protect its collections. It operated throughout the empire, from the Balkans to Arabia, wherever there were revenues to be gathered for European creditors. The Ottoman government was reduced to a subordinate role, receiving only what was left after the creditors had taken their share. This arrangement was presented, by its creators, as a rescue. The empire had been saved from outright collapse, they argued. Order had been imposed on chaotic finances. The remaining debts would be managed sustainably. But the reality was a transfer of sovereignty so complete that the empire, while maintaining its nominal independence, had become a financial colony. The flags still flew. The Sultan still sat on his throne. The armies still marched. But the real power, the power that came from controlling resources, had shifted to London and Paris. The case of Egypt illuminates even more starkly how this system worked. Egypt, nominally part of the Ottoman Empire but effectively independent under its own Khedive, had borrowed even more recklessly than the central government. The Khedive Ismail, a man of grand ambitions and poor financial judgment, had invested heavily in the Suez Canal, in railways, in urban development, in all the trappings of modernization. He had done so almost entirely with borrowed money, and by the 1870s, Egyptian debts exceeded what the country could possibly repay. The Suez Canal was the prize. This engineering marvel, completed in 1869, transformed global trade by providing a direct route from Europe to Asia. Ships no longer needed to sail around Africa, a journey of months. They could pass through the canal in hours. Whoever controlled the canal controlled the most important choke point in world commerce. The British, whose empire depended on trade and whose most valuable possession was India, understood this perfectly. When the Khedive's finances collapsed, the British moved with calculated precision. Benjamin Disraeli, the British Prime Minister, arranged for the purchase of the Khedive's shares in the Suez Canal Company with almost theatrical speed. The money was borrowed from the Rothschild banking family, repaid quickly from government funds, and the shares were secured. Britain now owned 44% of the canal, the largest single shareholding. The French owned most of the rest, but British strategic interests were now permanently embedded in Egyptian territory. But shares in the canal were not enough. The canal needed to be protected, and protection required control. Over the following years, British and French financial advisors effectively took over Egyptian finances, imposing austerity measures that caused widespread suffering and resentment. When Egyptian army officers, led by Ahmed Urabi, rebelled against foreign control in 1882, Britain intervened militarily. The rebellion was crushed, and Egypt became a British protectorate in all but name. It would remain under British control until 1956, 74 years later. The pattern was clear, repeated across the Ottoman world with devastating consistency. Debt led to dependency. Dependency led to foreign control of finances. Foreign control of finances led to foreign control of politics. And foreign control of politics led, eventually, to outright occupation or dismemberment. The process was gradual enough that at each stage, the victim could believe that the current arrangement was temporary, that sovereignty would be restored once the debts were paid. But the debts were never paid, could never be paid, because the system was designed not to be escaped but to be endured indefinitely. The British strategy was sophisticated in ways that deserved careful analysis. Direct colonization was expensive and troublesome. It required armies of occupation, administrators, and the constant risk of rebellion. It attracted criticism at home and abroad. It was, in short, inefficient. But financial control achieved the same results at a fraction of the cost. The debtor nation maintained its own government, its own army, its own civil service. It bore all the costs of administration. It suppressed its own rebellions. It maintained the appearance of independence that deflected criticism. But it did all this in service of creditor interests rather than its own. The profits flowed outward in multiple channels. Interest payments on the debts were the most obvious, but far from the only source of extraction. European merchants, protected by special legal privileges, dominated Ottoman commerce. European manufacturers, with their industrial efficiency, destroyed Ottoman craftsmen and captured Ottoman markets. European companies obtained concessions for railways, ports, utilities, and natural resources on terms enormously favorable to themselves. The Ottoman Empire became a source of raw materials and a market for finished goods, the classic colonial relationship, but without the costs and responsibilities of formal colonization. The human consequences were devastating. Peasants were taxed heavily to pay debts they had not incurred for projects that did not benefit them. Traditional industries collapsed under European competition, throwing craftsmen into poverty. Government services deteriorated as revenues flowed to creditors rather than schools or roads or hospitals. The proud officials of an ancient empire found themselves taking orders from foreign bankers, implementing austerity measures that caused suffering among their own people. What makes this history particularly instructive is how perfectly it was understood by its architects. The British Foreign Office and Treasury contained officials of remarkable intelligence who clearly comprehended what they were doing. Their private correspondence, preserved in archives, reveals a strategy that was conscious, deliberate, and ruthlessly effective. They knew that the loans they facilitated would probably not be repaid through normal commerce. They knew that default would lead to intervention. They knew that intervention would lead to control. This was not an unintended consequence but the intended result. Lord Cromer, who effectively ruled Egypt for a quarter-century as British agent and consul general, wrote with remarkable frankness about the methods employed. The goal, he explained, was not formal annexation but informal empire, control without responsibility, profit without accountability. The Egyptians and Ottomans were to be gradually educated in proper financial management, he claimed, while in practice they were being systematically exploited. The parallels to contemporary global finance are uncomfortable but unavoidable. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank, whatever their stated intentions, have often played roles remarkably similar to the European creditors of the 19th century. Developing nations, struggling with poverty and eager for growth, have borrowed heavily from international institutions. When they cannot repay, structural adjustment programs are imposed that require cuts to social spending, privatization of state assets, and opening of markets to foreign competition. The results have often been devastating for ordinary people while enriching international investors and local elites. The debt trap that captured the Ottoman Empire has been replicated, with variations, across Africa, Latin America, and Asia. Nations nominally independent find their economic policies dictated by foreign creditors. Resources that might have developed domestic economies flow outward to service debts. Political leaders who resist these arrangements find themselves isolated, sanctioned, or overthrown. The mechanisms are more sophisticated than those employed by 19th-century British bankers, but the essential dynamics remain remarkably similar. The story of how the Ottoman Empire fell into Britain's debt trap is not merely historical. It is a template that has been applied repeatedly and continues to be applied today. The specific currencies change. The specific institutions change. But the underlying logic, that debt is a tool of control, that lending can be a form of conquest, that financial dependency can be as complete as military occupation, remains constant. What options did the Ottomans have? Could they have avoided the trap? The question is easier to ask than to answer. The pressures they faced were real. Without modernization, the empire would have collapsed even sooner, conquered by European armies rather than European banks. The choice was not between borrowing and safety but between different forms of vulnerability. But within those constraints, different choices were possible. Some Ottoman officials, notably Sultan Abdul Hamid II who reigned from 1876 to 1909, understood the dangers of debt dependency and attempted to minimize new borrowing while developing domestic resources. He played European powers against each other, using German and French interests to balance British influence. He developed the Hijaz Railway to Mecca using domestic financing and volunteer labor rather than foreign loans. These strategies bought time but could not reverse the fundamental imbalance. Other responses were attempted and failed. The Young Turk Revolution of 1908 brought reformers to power who hoped to modernize the empire on its own terms, free from European control. But they inherited debts they could not escape and faced creditors they could not defy. Their reforms, interrupted by the Balkan Wars and then the catastrophe of World War I, never had time to mature. The empire entered the war partly to escape the stranglehold of debt, hoping that victory alongside Germany would free it from British and French domination. Victory did not come. The empire was partitioned, its territories distributed among the victors, its debts repudiated by successor states that disclaimed responsibility for the obligations of a regime they had overthrown. The Republic of Turkey that emerged under Ataturk was determined to avoid repeating the mistakes of the empire. It pursued economic self-sufficiency, nationalized foreign-owned enterprises, and refused to incur the kind of debts that had destroyed Ottoman sovereignty. This came at a cost in slower development, but it preserved independence. Other successor states, less fortunate, found themselves enmeshed in new forms of financial dependency from which they have never fully escaped. The Suez Canal, the prize that had drawn British intervention, remained under foreign control until 1956, when Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized it, triggering the Suez Crisis. The British and French, joined by Israel, invaded to retake the canal, but were forced to withdraw under American and Soviet pressure. It was the end of an era, the moment when the old colonial powers discovered that their methods of control no longer worked in a world of superpowers and rising nationalism. But the pattern of debt-based control did not disappear. It simply found new forms, new institutions, new mechanisms to achieve old goals. Understanding this history is essential for anyone who wants to understand the modern world. The global financial system is not a neutral mechanism for facilitating trade and development. It is a system of power, shaped by the interests of those who created it, designed to produce outcomes they desired. The rules of international finance, the structures of debt and repayment, the institutions that enforce these rules, all bear the imprint of the powers that established them and continue to benefit those powers disproportionately. This does not mean that all international lending is predatory or that all creditors are villains. Genuine development has been financed by genuine loans, repaid without exploitation. But the potential for debt to become a tool of domination exists in every transaction, and awareness of that potential is essential for those who would avoid the trap. The Ottomans did not understand what was happening until it was too late. We have no such excuse. The ruins of Ottoman dreams are scattered across the Middle East today, railways that were built to serve European interests, borders that were drawn to fragment potential opposition, resources that were developed to flow outward rather than circulate within. The region's struggles, its conflicts and poverty and instability, cannot be understood without reference to this history. The debt trap set by 19th-century bankers continues to shape 21st-century realities. As you reflect on this history of financial conquest, consider its implications for our own time. Which nations today are accumulating debts they cannot repay? Which creditors are positioning themselves to benefit from eventual default? What conditions are being attached to loans that seem generous today but will prove costly tomorrow? These are not abstract questions. They are the questions that will determine which nations remain sovereign and which become, like the Ottoman Empire, nominally independent but actually controlled. The story of Britain's debt trap offers no easy lessons, no simple formulas for avoiding exploitation. It offers something more valuable, an understanding of how these traps work, how they are set, how they close around their victims. With that understanding comes the possibility of resistance, the chance to recognize the trap before it closes, the opportunity to choose differently than the Ottomans chose. History does not repeat itself exactly, but its patterns recur, and those who understand the patterns have advantages over those who do not. If this exploration of financial empire has opened your eyes to patterns you hadn't seen before, I want to know what you think. How do you see these dynamics playing out in the modern world? What examples have you observed of debt being used as a tool of control? These questions matter, and diverse perspectives make the conversation richer. If this history has value for you, it likely has value for others who haven't yet heard it. Consider sharing it with someone who needs to understand how empires really work in the modern age. And for those who want to continue exploring the hidden mechanisms of power that shape our world, you know where to find more. The past has so much to teach us about the present, if we're willing to pay attention. These patterns haven't disappeared. They've only become more sophisticated, more hidden, more important to understand.